What is up, tube users? I am the stereotypical gamer, and welcome back to another installment of Overwatch 2 Heroes, an in-depth guide. Today, we are taking a look at one of the most satisfying heroes to play, and probably one of the most frustrating heroes to play against, and that is Hanzo. Let's dive right into things and talk about his passive ability. Hanzo's passive ability is Wall Climb. This allows Hanzo to, get this, climb walls. This passive lasts up to 1 second. With the increased movement speed Hanzo gets when climbing vertical, he can reach almost 9 meters of height. Plus, if Hanzo lands on any ledge of any kind, he will automatically mantle and climb it, even if the wall climb has already been used. Now, let's move on to talk about some of the more complex tools in Hanzo's kit. Hanzo's primary fire is Storm Bow. This is a bow that deals 27 to 120 damage to targets depending on the charge. It takes about 0.7 seconds to fully charge a shot. With this high damage for a fully charged shot, plus the ability to headshot, Hanzo can one-shot a lot of non-tanks in the game with a headshot. This is countered by it taking just over a second to recover and fully charge another shot, and the fact that each shot is an arcing projectile. Most of the time, the arcing won't be an issue until you get to longer ranges or if you're not fully charged. Now, let's move on to talk about Hanzo's first ability. Hanzo's first ability is Sonic Arrow. This is an arrow that is shot the same as his primary fire and can be fully charged to go further. Once the arrow lands, it will emit a sonic pulse, allowing Hanzo and his allies to see any enemies within a 9-meter radius of the pulse. The sonic arrow acts the same as a regular arrow for Hanzo, in that it will do scaling damage if it hits a target. The only difference is if an enemy target is hit, they will emit a sonic pulse showing where they are for 6 seconds. One key thing to note about this ability is if you press the ability button again, the arrow will change back to a regular arrow and won't recharge a shot if you are fully charged already. Now let's move on to talk about Hanzo's next ability. Hanzo's second ability is Storm Arrow. This ability changes Hanzo's next 5 arrow shots into Storm Arrows, which do less damage but can be fired at a faster rate. Each arrow does 65 damage and can be shot once every 0.24 seconds. Each shot travels at the same speed and distance as a fully charged Storm Arrow shot. These arrows can also bounce off a surface before disappearing. Another tip is you can use Hanzo's Sonic Arrow as one of the Storm Arrow shots to have it bounce off a surface once before activating. Now, let's quickly talk about Hanzo's third and final ability. Hanzo's third ability is Lunge. This ability allows Hanzo to lunge in any input direction while in midair. Typically on the ground, this is used by double jumping, but it can be used whenever Hanzo is off the ground. There really isn't much else to say about this ability, so let's move on to talk about Hanzo's ultimate. Hanzo's ultimate ability is Dragon Strike. This fires an arrow that contains 2 swirling dragons that deal 150 damage per second to enemies within a 4-meter range. These spirit dragons can travel through any wall or surface and travel an infinite distance. An interesting thing to note about this ability is how it technically works and how it can be countered. First, there's a charge time of 0.9 seconds, in which if Hanzo is stunned, the ultimate will not go off. Next, there is a travel time for the arrow of 0.6 seconds before the dragons become active. This arrow can be deflected or destroyed because it acts as a projectile. Once the dragons have been unleashed, however, there's no way to counteract them. The hitbox for this ultimate ability is the dragons themselves, meaning a target will take less damage on the edge of the ultimate rather than in the center. Now that we've gone over all of Hanzo's abilities, let's dive into heroes that counter and are countered by Hanzo. Hanzo is a lot like Widowmaker in the sense that he plays better at range and is very dangerous if he can hit his shots. But unlike Widowmaker, Hanzo has decent escapability with his lunge and wall climb, plus decent damage up close thanks to his storm arrows. A tank hero Hanzo plays well against is Junker Queen. Junker Queen has no way to get to a Hanzo that is vertical of her. That, plus having no barrier to defend herself, can be pretty difficult to deal with a Hanzo who's landing their shots. A DPS hero that Hanzo plays well against is Reaper. Reaper is an up-close range hero, and while he does have things to get to where a Hanzo is, he can be pretty vulnerable once those abilities are used. And maybe it's just me, but I've always had an easier time hitting headshots on an enemy Reaper than any other DPS hero. Finally, a support hero that Hanzo plays well against is Ana. Ana too plays the range game pretty well, but a good Hanzo can easily outdamage an enemy Ana, even with her sustainability. Plus, Hanzo has more escapability to avoid an enemy Ana, whereas Ana has nothing herself to escape with. Now, let's look at the flip side of things and talk about heroes that counter Hanzo. A Hanzo that can land his shots is always dangerous no matter the range. And while he plays better from range, he can still deal significant damage up close with his storm arrows. The best way I've learned to counter an enemy Hanzo is through speed. A tank hero that can do this is D.Va. D.Va can effectively close the gap on Hanzo thanks to her boosters and defense matrix. Then, once in close range, she can do a good amount of burst damage with her primary fire and rockets to finish off an enemy Hanzo. A DPS hero that plays well against Hanzo is Echo. Since Hanzo is a projectile-based hero, it can be tough for him to deal with flying heroes. This, paired with the great burst damage Echo can deal in close range, makes this fight unfavorable for Hanzo. Finally, a support hero that plays well against Hanzo is Mercy. For the same reason as Echo, since Mercy has the ability to fly, she can fairly easily maneuver around an enemy Hanzo. Now that we've gone over all the counters, let's dive into some tips and tricks for Hanzo. Hanzo can be a pretty tough hero to learn, especially being a projectile-based precision hero that you kind of just need to land your shots in order to be good with him. I would say one good tip that I could have to get better at this is to honestly just go and play AI matches with him. Just to get a better feel for how his projectiles work and to just work better with your aim. It's probably one of the simplest ways to just get better with Hanzo. Another tip I have for playing Hanzo is when you use your... Another tip I have for Hanzo, especially if you're playing on defense for any of the escort maps, is to use your sonic arrow before the round even starts at the enemy spawn. Typically, enemies will be next to where the spawn doors open, so using that sonic arrow just to see what their team comp is before the round even starts can be a really good way for your team to just be prepared and counteract whatever the enemy is doing. Another tip I have is to not underestimate the bounce effect that storm arrows have. I think a lot of people just either don't know about it or just kind of forget that that is a thing that storm arrows can do, and just using that and knowing the geometry, which can be tough because to just kind of get that geometry right, but a lot of people won't be expecting it, especially if they're around a corner or something. Typically, however, I usually try and save my storm arrow cooldown for if an enemy gets within close range. I just feel that it's easier to land shots with the storm arrows if enemies are within close range. But it's also, it has unlimited range, so it can also be good just to burst down an enemy if they're in line of sight or if you can hit them. As for Hanzo's ultimate, there are a couple of things that I like to do. Typically, you want to use it behind cover. That way, enemies won't be expecting it as much, and you can easily just try and get enemies who aren't aware, just out of position and stuff. But typically it just doesn't do a lot of damage, and for the most part I hardly ever get kills with it. So it's mainly used as a zoning tool, which it is super effective at doing that because it does have a sizable length to it. It can be really good for zoning enemies off the payload or off a point or anything like that. It has a decent radius to it that it can do those things, and so I usually use it as a zoning tool rather than trying to get kills with it. But yeah, that's all the tips and tricks I have for you today. Make sure to leave a like if you enjoyed, comment any other tips and tricks you have for Hanzo, and make sure to hit that subscribe button. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.
That rhythm.